Well, we agreed on the percentage of 80-20 in terms of responsibility, and we discussed some priorities about infrastructure. It was agreed at that time that we would return today to talk about how we would cover the cost of such a proposal. Last night, in the time in between, the president was making some sounds that we questioned how serious he could be if he were saying what he was saying. And last night, he put forth a letter saying that unless we passed the U.S., Mexico, Canada free trade agreement, there was no reason for us to, we couldn't go forward with infrastructure. We didn't see those two as related, but the fact is, hopeful, optimistic, and seeing the necessity for a big infrastructure initiative for our country, we went in the spirit of bipartisanship to find common ground with the president on this. He came into the room, made a statement that he made was, I won't even characterize it, but I will say this, and what I said after he left. Thomas Jefferson, when he was president of the United States, tasked his Secretary of the Treasury, Gallatin, to put forth an infrastructure proposal for the initiative for the country. It would follow the Lewis and Clark expedition, the Louisiana Purchase. It would be about the Erie Canal, Cumberland Road, things like that to build into America. 100 years later, Teddy Roosevelt did his infrastructure big initiative, and it was called the establishment of the National Park Service, the green infrastructure of America. We had hoped that we could give this president an opportunity to have a signature infrastructure initiative to create jobs, to improve the quality of life, to just do so much for our country on the ongoing, not only the jobs it created by building, but the commerce it would promote. And that included roads and bridges and mass transit, broadband into rural America and other underserved areas, clean water, wastewater, all of the things that have enormous needs. The American Society of Civil Engineers says it's in the trillions, the deficit we have. We're talking about a couple $2 billion. For some reason, maybe it was lack of confidence on his part, that he really couldn't match the greatness of the challenge that we have. Wasn't really respectful of the Congress and the White House working together. He just took a pass, and it just makes me wonder why he did that. In any event, I pray for the President of the United States, and I pray for the United States of America. I'm pleased to yield now to the distinguished Democratic leader of the Senate, Mr. Schumer.
Well, thank you, Speaker Pelosi, and to watch what happened in the White House would make your jaw drop. We Democrats believe in infrastructure. We believe our roads and bridges need repair. We believe that rural America, as well as inner city America, needs broadband. We believe that to bring clean, new energy around the country, we need a power grid, modernized and updated. We believe in modernizing our transportation fleet with electric cars. We believe in all these things. And so, despite signals in the previous few weeks that he might not be serious, we went forward. We came here very seriously. The president asked in his letter last night, where would Democrats spend the money on infrastructure? I was prepared to give him a 35-page plan detailing this in all the areas I mentioned and more that had the broad support of Senate and House Democrats. We are interested in doing infrastructure. It's clear the president isn't. He is looking for every excuse, whether it was let's do trade first, or whether it was he's not going to pay for any funding, or whether today that there are investigations going on. Hello? There were investigations going on 3 weeks ago when we met. And he still met with us. But now that he was forced to actually say how he'd pay for it, he had to run away. And he came up with this pre-planned excuse. And one final point, it's clear that this was not a spontaneous move on the president's part. It was planned. When we got in the room, the curtains were closed. The president, there was a place for him at the front so he could stand and attempt to tell us why he wouldn't do infrastructure. And of course, then he went to the Rose Garden with prepared signs that had been printed up long before our meeting. We want the president to do infrastructure. We want our Congress to perform its constitutional responsibilities and create jobs, create income, create wealth for the average American. We can do both. It's clear the president doesn't want to do any of that.
I just would add this one thing, that we had a very distinguished delegation to the Congress, very powerful House and Senate. As you can see, distinguished leader on the Appropriations Committee, Senator Patty Murray, Mr. Carper, the ranking member on the Committee of Jurisdiction that oversees some of what we're talking about here, Richie Neal, the chair of the Ways and Means Committee in the House, our distinguished Democratic leader in the House, Steny Hoyer. Where's Dick Durbin? Is he this way? The Senate whip, or we call it assistant leader, whatever the title is in the Senate.
Number two.
Debbie Stabenow of Michigan, a leader on all of these issues in her committees in the Congress. Our Assistant Speaker, Mr. Ben Ray Lujan of New Mexico. Our distinguished whip of the House, Democratic whip of the House, Mr. Clyburn. The chair of the, I love saying chair, the chair of the Transportation Infrastructure Committee, appropriate to this discussion, Mr. DeFazio, and the top Democrat on the Finance Committee in the United States Senate, Ron Wyden. So we came with heft, with commitment, with knowledge, which hoped with a shared vision of creating this great jobs initiative for our country. In the spirit of President Eisenhower, when he instituted the interstate highway system, it was important for jobs and mobility. It was a national security initiative, and it was bipartisan. Lyndon Johnson and Sam Rayburn in the House and Senate, the President of the United States, Dwight Eisenhower, we had hoped that we could do something comparable. Unfortunately, the president isn't ready for that. Thank you all very much.
All right, you've been listening to House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, along with a group of very powerful Democrats appearing there before the press. Let's go back to Ed O'Keefe, who's standing by in Washington, D.C., while we wait for our chief congressional correspondent, Nancy Cordes, to get mic'd up. Ed, you had some interesting reporting because Speaker Pelosi did not even want to characterize what happened in the meeting, but you and Rebecca Kaplan, our producers, have some nuggets from what took place. Why don't you recount them for our audience?
Basically, this was a 20-minute meeting, but only 3 of it really involved everyone being in the room together. Democrats are saying that they were left in a room. Leader Schumer describes it as one with the shades drawn for 15 minutes waiting for a president who was late. He came in for 3 minutes, walked in, didn't shake anyone's hands, according to a person familiar with what went on, or sit in his seat. He said he wants to work on infrastructure. He wants to work on passing the USMCA or the new NAFTA, the Farm Bill, and other things. But frankly, he said Speaker Pelosi, he couldn't believe that she had held that meeting with Democrats at 9 a.m. this morning to talk about impeachment or an impeachment inquiry. And he says, you guys have to sort this out first before we can work on these other things. This was the follow-up meeting to something that happened on May 1, 3 weeks ago, where Pelosi, Schumer, and the president met to discuss infrastructure and the possibility of launching on what everyone in Washington wants to work on, and that is a massive infrastructure spending program. The Democrats walked out there and said, great meeting. The president promises to get back to us in 3 weeks with a plan to pay for this. They went back to the Capitol, and immediately Republicans started to say, well, I don't know how you pay for it without either cutting other government programs or cutting taxes or something. And so clearly it was already dead on arrival. Last night, ahead of this meeting, the president sends a letter to Speaker Pelosi and Leader Schumer saying, I want to talk to you about infrastructure tomorrow, but first I want Congress to pass the USMCA, this new trade deal with Mexico and Canada. Once we get through that, then we can talk about infrastructure. That's a classic negotiating tactic done by a president and congressional leaders of another party. I have one priority, you have one priority, we have a shared priority. Let's get mine out of the way first, and then we'll work on the other one. Instead, today, he amplified it by going after them regarding the possibility of an impeachment inquiry by House Democrats. And as Chip Reed pointed out earlier while standing in the Rose Garden, the White House clearly was prepared for this because he already had the signage made up describing the cost and the size and the scope of the Mueller report. So in essence, he set up the Democrats for this. They probably knew that coming in because, frankly, they've had so many other meetings like this with him in recent months. But let there be no mistake, Vlad. While people in Washington would like to be able to work on dual tracks, legislation and congressional oversight, the president's making clear only one at a time. And this probably answers the question that many had after last fall's elections. Can Washington do both at the same time? And the answer is, at least for now, no, they can't. If anyone's expecting significant legislation of any kind to get passed in Washington, it's just not going to happen if the White House keeps this up.
Ed O'Keefe, stand by. I want to bring in Nancy Cordes. Nancy, so to Ed's point about what the president called the investigation track or the infrastructure track. He says, or the investment track. In another instance, he called it the investment track or the investigation track. President saying, not going to happen. I wonder, to the same point that now the Democratic leaders there and our reporting bears us out, that this may have been a setup by the president, given that he had prepared remarks and a prepared sign, that Nancy Pelosi, being as strategic as she is, by making those comments earlier this morning, must have known that the president was going to react to her saying so strongly that she believes that the president engaged in a cover-up. I'm wondering what you're hearing from her office.
Absolutely. I mean, there's no reason she had to say that this morning, just a few hours before she was set to meet with the president. There are any number of things that she could have said. Instead, nobody pushed her to say it. She was very deliberate, and this is someone who thinks a lot about her message ahead of time. So clearly, it was designed to tweak the president. And, we've seen this move by the Democrats multiple times because, frankly, if the president blows off a meeting like this, if top aides blow off hearings that they're scheduled to appear at, it does play into Democrats' hands in one way, which is that they can say, look, here is an administration in disarray that can't chew gum and walk at the same time. That is actively obstructing justice. This is the Democratic argument, by failing to show up, by failing to react to congressional oversight and respect a co-equal branch of government. So this is clearly very strategic on Democrats' parts. And the reality for the White House is, and Ed touched on this, is that the chances that the White House and Democrats were ever going to agree on a multi-billion-dollar infrastructure package was always quite slim, because the devil is in the details and how you pay for it. And Republicans on Capitol Hill were always going to give the White House an earful if it didn't find some way to offset all that spending. And the ways that the White House would want to offset that spending probably would not sit well with Democrats. So when the president blew up this meeting today and said it's not going to happen, he's sort of serving dual purposes as well, because he basically kills an initiative that probably was going to end up getting stuck in the end anyway.
Exactly.
So Ed, go ahead, jump in, Ed.
No, and Nancy's exactly right. He's avoiding a fight with his own party over an issue that everyone wants to work on, which is infrastructure, because the fight he'll have with fellow Republicans is how do you pay for it? He clearly wants this. He wants highways built and bridges built and airports built. Probably in the back of his mind, he's hoping that his name is on one of them one day.
Well,
but he can't get Republicans to agree to pay for it. And another sign that they're not serious about this at the White House, not for nothing, is the legislative affairs director quit this week. The person who's responsible for actually sitting down with congressional leaders and sorting out the details, Shakira Knight, announced just yesterday she's leaving. So they don't even have someone at the White House prepared to do this, to deal with the dirty details of putting together an infrastructure plan. So the president goes back to what he's best at doing, which is talking about the Mueller report and how he's being victimized by Democrats.
Ed raises a good point, Nancy, because it was interesting to hear Nancy Pelosi using some of these historical references. She talked about Thomas Jefferson and Albert Gallatin and the Lewis and Clark expeditions. She talked about Teddy Roosevelt and his plan for our great national parks. And she said, I don't think I've ever heard her say something like this, but that she had hoped that she would be able to help President Trump achieve some level of infrastructure plan plan that would have his name associated with something like Thomas Jefferson and Teddy Roosevelt and LBJ and Sam Rayburn. Right. And Chuck Schumer said he had a 35-page report of the stuff that they could work on. I didn't see that, but maybe he had it in his hand. It does sound as if they at least have an idea of what they would like to see. But as Ed points out, and as Speaker Pelosi pointed out, or maybe it was Senator Schumer, the president doesn't want to pay for it.
Right. I mean, details have always been a big problem for this White House, unless it is a real pet issue to someone like Stephen Miller, something like immigration. Often the president will come out and make these very lofty promises. Remember how he promised that they were working on a health care reform plan and then was basically forced to admit, oh, actually, never mind. It's coming in 2020 after the election. Often the nitty gritty, the hard work of actually crafting legislation and working through all the pay-fors is very difficult for this White House. And that was probably going to be the case today. The Democrats had a very detailed plan because this is something that they have been thinking and talking about for a while. And the White House was coming to the table without the same level of detail. And Speaker Pelosi has been able to get the better of the president before because she has a much better command of the details than he does. I, too, was struck, Vlad, as you pointed out, by her language in this, I can't say it's a press conference because they didn't take any questions, but this press availability, when she talked about these great men, Thomas Jefferson and the like. Clearly, the message she was trying to send is that those were great men who rose above politics when necessary, and they're dealing with someone who isn't able to set some of these smaller issues aside and do the important work that is required for the American people.
And remember, Vlad, that's not lip service. This is someone who has spoken at length and over the course of her leadership of the Democratic caucus of her respect for the institution of the presidency. Despite profound disagreements with George W. Bush back in the day, she always maintained she had profound respect for the institution. Same in this case, and she said it in interviews with us and with other outlets, that you have to respect the presidency itself. So talking about Jefferson and saying that she's praying for the president is totally consistent with her character, not something that she would just say today in a patronizing way. It speaks to her profound belief that there's got to be a way for the presidency and Congress to work together.
So, Nancy, to that and to some of the back and forth that we've seen between the Congress and now the White House, I wonder if this is a game of chicken in the sense that now President Trump has ratcheted up the tension. There are a number of Democrats, you and I spoke earlier about, that are calling to begin an impeachment inquiry, not impeachment proceedings, but an inquiry into impeachment. The president essentially saying that he can't work on investment or infrastructure unless the investigations are over. The House saying that they're going to continue to do what they call their constitutional responsibility to investigate. So now I wonder if the president has thrown it back in their court, that they say, look, we now have even more cover to go down this path, this inquiry that some members are calling for with regards to Speaker Pelosi.
Right. I mean, look, in some ways, the president is being utterly consistent. He isn't always consistent, but in this case, he said right after the 2018 midterm elections, at multiple times, including in press conferences, that Democrats have to choose, that they can either investigate him or they can work with him, but he's not going to do both. So in a way, he's just kind of returning to that principle. And the fact that he was willing to meet and talk with them about infrastructure may have been an aberration in the first place, because now he is reasserting that message that he will not work with Democrats if they are going to pursue investigations. The problem, the flaw with that logic, however, is he actually does need Democrats to push through his top agendas, things like trade, things like a budget agreement. He is going to need some Democratic cooperation, so he can't turn his back on them entirely. Yes, I do think you're absolutely right, however, that it gives Democrats broader leeway to conduct these investigations. But there is always the risk, and this is why Pelosi and other longtime Democrats who lived through the Clinton impeachment are so wary of going back there again. You know, as politicized as things are already here on the Hill. As soon as you start talking about impeachment, whether it's an inquiry or proceedings or articles of impeachment, whatever it is, that is like a hand grenade thrown into the middle of everything that is taking place on Capitol Hill. And that creates a whole new level of political tension. And so that is sort of the third rail that many Democrats, even the ones, many of them who I spoke to after this meeting this morning, said they're just not ready to go there yet, and they are still in the majority.
You know, Ed and Nancy, the other language that Nancy Pelosi uses, she said that she is praying for President Trump. And I thought that was sort of interesting, too. I know we do know that she is a strong Catholic. She is a regular attendant of church. But I thought that language was interesting, too, just because the president generally uses language that is meant to bully. And in this case, and Speaker Pelosi is known for doing the same, but in this case, she used sort of, you know, a Christian sentiment.
Right. I think that Democrats feel that they benefit from appearing to be the adult in the room and not storming off and not getting overly emotional. And so Pelosi has said that multiple times in the past. And just the other day, she said in an interview that she believes she respects the office of the presidency more than President Trump does. And make no mistake, that sort of appearing to be the reluctant leader being dragged in the direction of impeachment proceedings works for her politically, because she gets to look as if she is being very deliberate about all of this, not rushing to judgment. But at the end of the day, whether it's in a month or a year, if she does come around, if she does respond to growing calls from her caucus to pursue an inquiry or impeachment proceedings, she will then be able to say, look, I wasn't playing politics. I was holding out as long as I could. I hoped that we could avoid this, but now we can't. So, you know, there is some political benefit to Pelosi to having a very vocal minority in her caucus right now chanting impeachment, 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 and being the reluctant leader who's saying, no, I'm holding out.
Meanwhile, before we wrap this up, let's just talk briefly about something that the president kept hitting on during his remarks, and something that he's been hitting on Twitter for quite some time, the numbers on the economy. And we have some new CBS polling out on the economy that supports what he says, which is that the economy is doing well by all accounts, and that Democrats and Republicans alike do believe that he, in part, is responsible for that.
Yeah, those are interesting numbers, and his numbers have actually, his overall approval ratings have rebounded since last summer, in part because all sides of the aisles essentially are giving him credit for his performance on the economy. But you look beyond that issue, which, you know, is kind of indisputable these days, that the economy is in good shape. He's underwater when it comes to trade and immigration, which are two of his other signature issues, or at least ones that he likes to talk about a lot. And deeper in the numbers, a lot of people, I forget the percentage exactly, concerned that he has profited personally by virtue of being president, that his family continues to, you know, reap profits from the fact that he's in the White House. And that speaks to some of the justification that Democrats believe they have in continuing to pursue questions about his family's company's relationship with the government and with foreign governments and with other entities that are trying to do business with the administration. But you know, and this also speaks to another